It is that season again, which means it's time to spook it up here on the channel. And what better way to do that than to dive back into the world of jinn and spirits in the Islamicate and Middle Eastern world. We've all watched the Hollywood horror movies that in different ways depict cases of demonic possession. From the classic The Exorcist to the more recent Conjuring movies, it's a topic that keeps fascinating and unsettling people around the world. But these stories are often very Christian-centric in their nature. The demonology that is presented is almost exclusively based on Christian theology, and the solution often involves, at least in some way, things like crucifixes and holy water. Now, there have been some diversifying developments, such as the 2019 movie The Vigil, which depicts an encounter with a Jewish possessing spirit called the Dybbuk. But what about the Islamic world of jinn? To many people, their knowledge of jinn is limited to genies in movies like Aladdin, and to say the least, this does not necessarily capture the nature and characteristics of the actual jinn from the Islamic world. And what about possession? Can jinn actually possess human beings? And if so, are there some interesting or known examples of this throughout history? Today, we're going to explore the fascinating and really interesting world of jinn possession in the Islamicate and Middle Eastern world. The jinn are a vast and fascinating group of beings. I've already covered jinn in a general sense a few years ago, which you can check out if you want a deeper overview. But in shorter terms, jinn are a group of beings in Middle Eastern and Islamic lore that can take on many different forms and shapes. They appear in the Quran and so have been established as an important component of the Islamic religion, even though they may have been interpreted in different ways. In the Quran it says, quote, "And he created jinn from smokeless fire." Thus, jinn are a type of being that exists in the world, created from smokeless fire, and that is distinct from humans who were created from clay and angels created from light. Jinn are conceived as creatures mostly invisible to human senses, but they can sometimes become perceivable and even interact with us in different ways. Often, most people will talk about jinn as exclusively evil creatures, perhaps equivalent to demons in Christianity, but this is actually not accurate. Instead, jinn are actually neutral beings, more similar to how actual daimones in ancient Greece actually functioned, that they could be both evil and good. They're not necessarily one or the other. Jinn have societies of their own, they have families, they even have religions. So there are Muslim jinn, there are Christian jinn, Jewish jinn, etc. And as I said, they can be both friendly or dangerous, both good and evil. With that said, even in the Islamic world, the jinn are mostly associated as being evil creatures for the most part, but officially this is the case. Jinn can be both good and evil. In fact, jinn is sometimes seen more as a kind of umbrella term for all kinds of different beings with characteristics of their own. And under the wider term of jinn, we have beings that are more exclusively and decidedly evil or dangerous, such as the ifrit, the marid, the ghul, and shaitan or shayateen. Indeed, in Islamic theology, it is considered that Iblis, or Satan, is in fact a jinn. Looking at the folklore of many regions and cultures around the world, we can find many different examples of supernatural beings or creatures that became subsumed under the wider category of jinn. It is also common to say that the polytheist god of other religions, in other words, false gods according to Islam, are in fact jinn that humans have mistakenly interpreted to be gods. So as you can see, the world of the jinn is a very large and complex one, but our topic of interest and focus today is more narrow and specific, namely the question about jinn possession. Jinn can be found basically everywhere, but are particularly associated with dark places, with old ruins and cemeteries. Humans can encounter them in different ways, but can they actually become possessed? Well, we have a clue for this in the Arabic word for a madman or crazy person, Majnoon, such as the famous love story of Layla and Majnoon. Majnun literally means something like possessed by a jinn, and you can tell just by looking at the name and seeing that it has the same 3-letter root in Arabic. In fact, the question of jinn possession has been a contested issue among Islamic scholars. Not everyone agrees that it is a real thing. As an example of a non-skeptic, the famous 14th century theologian and Hanbali jurist Ibn Taymiyyah, often seen as a founding figure of Salafism, wrote that, quote, "The existence of the jinn is an established fact according to the book, the Sunnah, and the agreement of the early scholars. Likewise, the penetration of the jinni into the human body is also an established fact according to the consensus of leading Sunni scholars. The jinni enters one seized by fits and causes him to speak incomprehensible words unknown to himself. If one seized by fits is struck with a blow enough to kill a camel, he does not feel it." On the other hand, there are other major historical Islamic scholars that have denied its reality, such as Fakhruddin al-Razi, the literalist Ibn Hazm, and maybe even al-Ghazali. Ibn Hazm calls it superstition and says that, quote, "Such things are not possible," in other words, people don't fall for it, "except to the weak minds of the elderly. That he, the devil, can speak using someone's tongue is senility and clear insanity. We seek protection in God from deception and affirming superstitions." But regardless, we can be sure that it is and has been a very common opinion that jinn possessions do indeed happen. And there exists and have existed various techniques and traditions related to how to get rid of such spirits through different kinds of exorcism. There are different words for jinn possession in Arabic, one of which is sara', and a person possessed thus becomes a masru'. Another common term is mas, meaning to touch or feel. Just like in a lot of ancient traditions of spirit possession, such as Mesopotamia, the possession of jinn is often connected with disease, especially mental afflictions. If someone shows signs of a mental disorder, this could be a sign of jinn possession. We saw from Ibn Taymiyyah's quote that symptoms could include speaking incomprehensible words and of being seized by fits, all of which could be symptoms of some sort of mental disorder. From the earliest recorded periods, we find the idea that jinn can somehow affect human beings in different ways. The pre-Islamic poets were often thought to get their inspirations from such spirits, which allowed them to compose such beautiful verses. And similar ideas still exist in certain parts of the Islamic world today. So what are some examples of this? In Morocco, there is a famous jinn called Aisha Qandisha. Usually, jinn will be referred to and understood collectively or as a general whole, but there are examples, such as here, of specific individual jinn or with names and characteristics of their own. Aisha Qandisha is a frightening creature that will often take on the form of a human woman and seduce unsuspecting men, either killing and eating them or sometimes even possessing them. Stories about men possessed by Lady Aisha are reported to lose interest completely in human women and suffer various kinds of physical and mental ailments. Another example comes from Central Asian and Kurdish lore, where there is a type of jinn called the Al, which targets women and pregnant women in particular. The Al can steal babies and even the fetus from pregnant women and eat them, which of course reminds us of certain creatures from Mesopotamian lore, such as the Lilitu and the demon Lamashtu. The Al is also said to be able to possess women and make them go insane. Robert Lebling explains, quote, "This can happen when a lonely woman visits a public bathhouse and strikes up a conversation with another lonely woman who happens to be a demon in disguise. The Al then offers to wash the woman's back. Suddenly, the demon shows its true nature and the unfortunate woman falls unconscious. When she awakens, she has lost her mind." In some areas where Farsi, the Iranian language, is spoken, such women are called jinn zada, offspring of the jinn. According to Islamic tradition, there are various reasons why a possession can happen. As we've explained in earlier videos, there are different occult and magical practices that have been popular in the Islamicate world across history, such as those involving talismans or invocations, and in the more malicious examples, curses. While most of the quote-unquote magic in this tradition is working with God and the power of God, there are some examples of summoning or working with jinn in different ways. We saw this in the famous, or maybe I should say infamous, Shams al-Ma'arif, for instance. And a jinn possession can happen as a result of this. Perhaps someone has cursed you, or one of your own rituals involving jinn has backfired and now you're in trouble. In the case of the Shams al-Ma'arif, it is said that only owning a copy of the book or reading it will bring jinn upon you. But jinn have emotions and feelings too, and a possession can also be the result of you insulting or harming them in some way, as a kind of retaliation. In one of the core stories from the 1001 Nights, the story of the merchant and the jinn, it tells of how a merchant is confronted by an angry ifrit who wants to kill him. The reason? The merchant was walking along eating dates and throwing the seeds around, accidentally hitting and killing the son of this particular ifrit. Now, in this story, this doesn't result in an actual possession, but it does showcase how jinn can become angry with the behavior of humans and might use possession as a kind of retaliation or revenge. Jinn can also feel lust towards human beings, and there are instances of sexual relations between humans and jinn, as well as cases where humans even marry jinn. Indeed, the famous early Muslim philosopher and scientist Al-Jahiz wrote that, quote, "Some Islamic theologians allege that intermarriage and crossbreeding has occurred between the jinn and humans, according to the Almighty's statement, 'Make them partners in wealth and offspring.' This is apparent since female jinn undertake to seduce human men out of passion, seeking fornication, and likewise the men of the jinn, human women." So, say a possession actually happens. How does this manifest itself? In other words, what are the symptoms of a jinn possession? As you can imagine, there are a lot of symptoms, there are a lot of different symptoms, and many of them today would simply be attributed to mental disorders of different kinds. Some common symptoms are mood shifts and changes in personality, depression, uncontrollable laughter or crying, epileptic convulsions, a changed voice like in those demon movies, suddenly being able to speak a foreign language that you didn't know before, recurring nightmares and insomnia, among much else. Now, some of you might be thinking, many of these kind of sound like me, so am I possessed by a jinn? Probably not, as symptoms will also often include religious aspects, such as negative reactions to the recitation of the Quran or the call to prayer, or a general abandonment of religious observances. Regardless, it sounds like being possessed by a jinni is pretty unpleasant, and it is certainly something that people want to get rid of. For this reason, there have existed different techniques of exorcism, or ruqya in Arabic, that are employed to deal with such a situation. Now, this is truly a vast topic, and much of what we have discussed in earlier videos on the Islamic and occult sciences are directly related to it. We can see across history, and in many places still today, that various kinds of talismans and amulets are used to get rid of jinn and other troubles. A talisman can technically be any object. You're probably thinking about some necklace with a locker, and that could definitely be a talisman, but there are many other things that could be employed in this kind of magic too. From a simple piece of paper to bronze bowls and even clothes. The important part was imbuing these objects with occult power, usually by adding certain symbols, writings, or images onto them. Some of the most common ways of turning an object into a talisman would be to write on it the names of God in Arabic. Primary of these is of course the name Allah, but one also finds names like Ar-Rahman, the merciful, and Al-Ahad, which means the one, etc. If not God himself, then one might write the names of one or more of his angels, such as Jibril, Mikael, or one of his prophets, perhaps Muhammad, Moses, or Solomon. For many Shiites, one might also write the names of one of the imams, or spiritual successors to the Prophet Muhammad. Very common is also to write the Shahada, or Muslim proclamation of faith, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, or direct verses from the Quran. Many verses, like the Ayat al-Kursi, or throne verse, are thought to be especially powerful in this regard. So a person that is possessed by a jinni could advise a specialist in these kinds of sciences, and might be given an amulet containing verses from the Quran that he or she can wear around their neck. Maybe hang them over their bed, as another example, or other places in their home, etc. It is thought that the very presence of these verses, or names of God, for instance, have such power in themselves to ward off evil spirits. If you have visited a Middle Eastern home, you'll know that different kinds of amulets are very common to find, such as the Hand of Fatima, for example, which often has this very exact purpose. There are also many other different kinds of protective amulets, such as talismanic shirts and clothes, among much else, and other images or motifs that have protective powers, such as the so-called magic squares. In some of the classic books of occult sciences in the Islamicate world, such as the Shams al-Ma'arif and the Ghayat al-Hakim, we find different kinds of instructions for protection. Aside from wearing amulets of protective verses, words, or images, one can also, for instance, burn the object on which these words are written and then inhale the fumes. So these are some of the more occult practices for protection against jinn possession. And one should remember that these practices have been very widespread and popular in the Islamicate world and still is in many parts of the Middle East today. But they have also been criticized and seen as un-Islamic by many scholars, especially today, and indeed has even been seen as the very opposite of Islamic, as being basically heretical. And to these more skeptical or critical scholars, there is only one particular form of ruqya or exorcism that is legitimate according to the religion, which does not involve these more occult aspects like talismans, for instance. Among these more quote-unquote safe practices are such things as simply reciting the Quran over the afflicted person, particularly certain surahs or verses that are thought to be effective for this purpose, such as the aforementioned Ayat al-Kursi, Surat al-Nas, or the haunting and short Surat al-Falaq, or chapter of the daybreak. Quote, "Say, I seek refuge in the Lord of daybreak, from the evil of what he has created, from the evil of darkness when it enshrouds, from the evil of those who blow upon knots, and from the evil of the envier when he envies." According to the exorcist tradition in Islam written by Bilal Phillips, this initial step is usually followed by, and here I quote, "Quranic verses may be recited over water and given to the patient to drink. Olive oil over which the Quran has been read may be rubbed on the aching limbs. 3. One's communication is established with the possessing spirit. Information is sought concerning its name and its reason for possessing the patient. 4. Through admonition, scolding, and or persuasion, the jinn or group of jinn are then encouraged to leave. 5. If the possessing jinni refuses to leave through encouragement, it is then tortured by further Quranic recitation. It is commanded to leave and to take an oath not to return. 6. Beating may be resorted to in order to inflict pain on the possessing entity only when the human personality is not conscious. This is used in conjunction with commands to the jinni to leave. 7. Water over which the Quran has been recited is used for drinking, and olive oil over which the Quran has been recited is used for rubbing on the aching parts of the body. These are, in other words, some of the most common and recurring techniques for dealing with jinn possession. But there are other, more unusual examples too. There is, for instance, the fasting tradition of Zar that we find in places like Egypt, Ethiopia, and across the Middle East, where spirit possession is handled through intense music and dance to appease the possessing spirits. This is a fascinating ritual complex that we will dedicate a full episode to, hopefully later this month. For this reason, we won't be going any deeper into it right now, but it is worth knowing that such more unique and elaborate forms of possession and exorcism, or in this case appeasement, exist as well. So this has been only a brief overview of the world of jinn possession in the Islamic world. We've discussed that the very reality of this kind of possession has been debated by Islamic scholars throughout history, but that examples of it and different ways of dealing with it can be found both across history and today in different regions of this larger Islamic world and the Middle East. We've also explored a few different ways that exorcism or ruqya is used on people that are afflicted with this kind of possession. Hopefully this has been educational as well as put you in a nice spooky October mood. I will continue to speak about the darker aspects of the world's different religions and cultures for the remainder of the month of October, and I hope you are as excited as I am for the continuing of this year's spooky season, or Shocktober as we call it over here on the channel. Again, look forward to more spooky content over the coming weeks, and I will see you then.